Thanks very much, Ryan. It's nice to be introduced by a fellow Canadian, and it's an honor to speak here at the Clinton School of Public Service. For me, a great honor. I hope this evening to give you some thoughts not only about nuclear energy, but about energy in general and the future of that subject for the United States and for the world. The Clean and Safe Energy Coalition, of which I'm co-chair, and you'll see some materials in front of you there that you can take home with you that give you a description of the organization and how to join it for free if you're so inclined by the end of the presentation. It's a national effort supported by the Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, D.C. to build a grassroots coalition in support of new nuclear energy in the United States. There's two co-chairs, myself and Christine Todd Whitman, former head of the EPA and former governor of New Jersey. The two of us are ambassadors for this effort, which has been capable now of building a broad coalition of labor, business, political, academic, leaders in communities across the country. We have 2,500 members, but some of those members represent hundreds of thousands of people. We also have watched in the 4.5 years since the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition was formed, public support for nuclear energy grow to its present level of over 60% of people in the US, when asked, should we have nuclear energy, more nuclear energy in the future, say yes. Interestingly, the closer people live to nuclear plants, the higher their support for nuclear energy. Within 10 miles of the 64 nuclear plant sites in the United States, not including the people who work at the plant, the average level of support is 80%. In some cases, it's as high as 90%. So people who live near nuclear plants know they are good neighbors. A little about my history and how I came into this situation. I was doing my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia in the late 1960s when I joined a small group of activists in a church basement in Vancouver who were planning a protest against US hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. It was the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the Cold War, and as a science student in ecology, I had become radicalized by the fact that we were about to be annihilated in an all-out exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union, and I became a radical environmental activist during my PhD years. I joined this little group and worked with them to plan what became the first campaign of Greenpeace against US hydrogen bombs. We sailed a small boat across the Pacific Ocean to draw media attention to our cause. Tens of thousands of people ended up marching in the street. It became a Supreme Court decision, 4-3, in favor of letting the nuclear test go forward. We made Walter Cronkite's CBS Evening News as being the spearhead of the opposition to these tests. And in the end, that nuclear test became the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. There were more atomic tests after that, but President Nixon, again at the height of the Cold War and the height of the nuclear war, canceled the remaining hydrogen bomb tests in that series. In retrospect, it was a major turning point in the global arms race, and it was the birth of what became Greenpeace. I spent the next 15 years full-time on the front lines of the movement internationally, next taking on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific, which we succeeded in driving underground. Finally, they ended those nuclear tests in the mid-90s. We then went on to campaign on the high seas against the Japanese and Soviet factory whaling fleets, which were slaughtering tens of thousands of whales per year in all the oceans of the world. We won that campaign eventually. And then we took on issues like toxic waste and nuclear issues. Now, we got a lot of things right in those early years of the environmental movement, and I'm very proud of the work we did in those days, but we made one serious error that has lived with Greenpeace to this day and much of the rest of the environmental movement, and that is we made the mistake of lumping nuclear energy in with nuclear weapons, as if everything with the word nuclear was evil. Now, in retrospect, I know this was a serious error. It would be the same kind of thing as if we banned nuclear medicine because it uses radioactive materials. And as a matter of fact, those isotopes that are used in nuclear medicine are created in nuclear reactors. It's very clear today to me that the cost of that mistake that the environmental movement made in the 70s and 80s is that there's a lot more coal-fired power plants today than there would have been if we'd kept building nuclear plants at the rate of 30 or 40 per decade or more, which is what we were doing at the time that came to an end. And it was partly because of the environmental movement that nuclear energy in the United States stopped moving forward and the industry shifted to coal. So that's a kind of a legacy that one would like to live down. And part of the reason I'm very proud to be a co-chair of the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition is because, for example, Arkansas gets 26% of its electricity from nuclear power, from 2 plants just an hour northwest of here. But it also gets 43% of its electricity from coal, a very important part of the electricity base in the state. If we hadn't been against nuclear energy in those days, those numbers may well be reversed today. It may well be 26% coal and 43% nuclear instead, and that would be better for the environment. So that's why I'm proud to be doing what I'm doing. Let's look at the global picture for a minute. 86% of all the world's energy is from fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. Therefore, fossil fuels are by far the most important energy sources for our civilization, and that needs to be recognized. But there are many good reasons why we should be moving off fossil fuels to some extent, reducing our dependency on them. They're not going to go away. We are going to be using coal and oil and gas for a long time into the future. Many, many decades. In the case of coal, certainly for many, many centuries. But we are ever increasing our use of fossil fuels worldwide, and they are non-renewable. So just for that reason alone, we have to look at the consequences of our dependency. I put down 5 reasons why we should reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. The first one that is in everybody's mind these days is the climate change issue. Because fossil fuels are the main cause of greenhouse gas, CO2 in particular, it is believed that we should reduce our fossil fuels. Some people, such as former Vice President Al Gore, go so far as to say that within 10 years we should eliminate fossil fuels altogether from our civilization. This is far-fetched in the extreme. That's not going to happen, and it would actually be a cure, if it was a cure, that would be far worse than the disease. Because when 86% of your energy comes from fossil fuels, you have to realize how much it would undermine everything we do in order to just eliminate that in what would basically be overnight in 10 years from now. But looking at it in a more rational sense and thinking of decades down the road, where do we want to be in the year 2100 in terms of the energy mix that we're using to support our civilization? Climate is one of the issues that many people are very much concerned about. For me, it's not on the top of the list. I'm concerned about the climate issue and the rate at which we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere, but I don't particularly buy into the doom and gloom scenarios that are put forward about catastrophic warming and all the species going extinct and civilization collapsing in short order. On the other hand, it's a genuine issue that has to be taken into account. In some ways, more important from my perspective is the issue of air pollution itself. Nothing causes more damage to public health in this world than the emissions from fossil fuels, the pollution. This is a fact. Just think about it. What else causes more damage to public health that we do than the emissions from our transportation and electricity generating plants and heating our homes and all the rest, the air pollution that goes into the atmosphere? The second reason to reduce our fossil fuel dependence is conservation, as I mentioned. We are burning 300 million years worth of fossil fuels in a few centuries here. That's hardly a model of sustainable development. If we want future generations to have these very important and versatile resources, then we need to reduce our use of them in our generation. The fourth point is that there are better things to do with fossil fuels than just burn them, especially when there are other technologies that can do the same thing, make electricity, for example, and do it better, reducing the amount of pollution that goes into the air. And then there are the geopolitical aspects. In the United States, that has mainly to do with oil and mainly to do with Middle East oil, but just the fact that the transportation system in this country is entirely dependent on oil from regimes that are not particularly friendly or unstable or whatever. This is the cause of wars. In Europe, the main issue is the dependence on Russian gas that they have got themselves into by making so much of their energy needs natural gas. So for all those reasons, we should reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. How do you go about that? Well, there is one theory that you build a whole bunch of windmills and put in a whole bunch of solar farms, and that is going to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. I've studied that in depth, and I simply do not believe that that is the answer for the future. The only place people are building large wind and solar installations is where there are huge taxpayer subsidies to do that, or where there are political mandates requiring utilities to put in or to pay for electricity which is so much more expensive than conventional power that it is going to change the whole economy of the country if we continue on down that path much further. Take Spain, for example, which has committed over 126 billion euros to solar and wind energy in the future. They are at the present time going broke, partly because of that, and they're going to retroactively tear up the documents that they signed with people for a 20-year guaranteed price for wind and solar. I don't know how many of you know it, but solar energy is basically about 10 times the price of conventional hydroelectric, nuclear, and fossil fuel power, coal-fired power. About 10 times. We cannot afford to do that at any large scale, and I would argue, why do it at any scale when there are other renewable and sustainable technologies that can replace fossil fuels that don't cost 10 times as much as the conventional energy sources. And then there is wind, which doesn't cost as much as solar, but costs 3 times as much as conventional energy. And both wind and solar are completely unreliable and only available for a small percentage of the time. The truth is, every time you build a wind farm, you have to build a gas plant of equal size to back it up when the wind is not blowing. Some would say, why not just build the gas plant? Why go to the huge expense of building the wind farm too? Well, when the wind is blowing, you can turn the gas plant off. And that would be the way of describing the benefit. We need to figure out whether that's really worth the amount of CO2 that is saved in terms of how much money is spent on these extremely expensive wind farms. At the very best, you get a 30% capacity factor from wind, and at the very best, you get a 15 to 20% capacity factor from solar. In other words, the rest of the time, you have to make the electricity with something else. In a way, why not just build something else? And that something else could be a nuclear plant. Nuclear plants do not cost 10 times as much to operate as conventional power sources. They are actually a very cost-effective form of electricity once you have built the plant, which is very expensive compared to, say, building a coal plant or a gas plant. But once you've built the nuclear plant, you then have clean, emissions-free electricity at a reasonable price for a long period into the future, employing people in good jobs, rather than putting our money into the renewables that are the most expensive and the most unreliable. There are actually 3 alternative renewable technologies that make far more sense than either wind or solar. The first one of those is the most important source of renewable electricity, which is hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power produces about the same amount of energy globally as nuclear energy does. In fact, hydroelectric and nuclear are the only two large-scale baseload alternatives to fossil fuels for producing electricity. Hydroelectric already supplies 6% of the power in the United States, but in my country of Canada, it supplies 60% of the electricity. In Switzerland, it provides 65%. In Brazil, it provides 80% of the electricity. If you look around the world, you will find, in fact, that there are a vast range of different mixes of technologies providing the electricity to countries. Western Europe is a very interesting example, where if you look at the carbon dioxide emissions on a per capita basis, the three lowest in Western Europe are Sweden, Switzerland, and France. The highest are UK, Germany, and Denmark. What is the difference among those countries? The ones that have predominantly a mix of hydroelectric and nuclear have the lowest CO2 emissions because they're not using fossil fuels to generate their electricity. Sweden is about 50-50 nuclear and hydro. Switzerland, as I mentioned, is 65% hydro, and then it's 35% nuclear. France is 80% nuclear and 10% hydro, and just a small amount of gas. So between those three, they have by far the lowest CO2 emissions per capita. And so if we actually want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we have to look at hydroelectric and nuclear. Now, there are a number of countries, Canada included, along with China and Brazil and Chile, that still have large resources of hydroelectric power to tap into. And therefore, it makes sense that that is what they should develop. It's renewable, it's cost-effective, it's clean, and very versatile. But the United States doesn't have that kind of resource of hydroelectric power remaining. There's maybe a few thousand megawatts of improving existing dams and building some new smaller ones, but there just isn't that resource. So the real choice here in the United States, as it is in a number of other countries, is the choice between fossil fuels and nuclear going forward for electricity production. The Clean and Safe Energy Coalition's position is that we should focus on increasing the nuclear side. For example, when coal-fired power plants come to their end of life, they are on sites that already have transmission lines running from them to the demand. They already have a water cooling source because they, like nuclear, have to have a source of cooling water. There is a logical place to say, okay, that coal-fired plant has run out of its service, it's time to tear it down and replace it with something else. There you can put a nuclear plant. And indeed, many of the nuclear plant proposals going forward are going on existing nuclear plant sites. Again, where there already are the transmission corridors going to a place where there's a demand and where there's cooling water. And indeed, most of the nuclear plant sites in the United States were designed for more than one plant. Some of them now have 2 plants, but many of them were designed to have 4 or more nuclear plants. In other words, the resources for cooling and the capability of putting in transmission is already there on those sites to enlarge them from their existing capacity. I have a little thing that goes renewable, clean, sustainable, and green. Many people would just think of those 4 words as basically all meaning the same thing, because that's what we want: renewable, sustainable, clean, and green. But they actually all mean quite different things if you analyze them carefully. And it's really important, I believe, in discussing public policy issues and issues of science and technology to be very clear in our terminology. Renewable. We all know what that means. It basically means that it is self-replenishing on a fairly short time scale. Hydroelectric energy, for example. Water evaporates from the oceans and the lakes and from the land into clouds, falls on the mountain, and we catch it coming down through turbines and make power. That's a fairly short, renewable cycle that occurs naturally on the Earth. But just because an energy source is renewable or a material is renewable does not necessarily mean that it is sustainable. The buffalo were renewable, but they weren't harvested in a sustainable way. The Atlantic codfish are renewable. Many forests, all forests are renewable, but many of them have not been renewed because they have not been managed sustainably. Then we come to clean. Clean basically means there's no pollution. Just because something is renewable doesn't necessarily mean that it's clean. For example, burning wood with no pollution control is actually very dirty, even though it is renewable. So renewable doesn't necessarily mean either sustainable or clean. Sustainable means it will last for a long time at the present rate of use. Nuclear energy is almost the ultimate in sustainable energy resources, in that the nuclear fuels uranium and eventually thorium, which is another element that can be used to make nuclear energy. They're not limitless, but they are so abundant that they will last for thousands or tens of thousands of years. So it's non-renewable, but it's very sustainable. And there are lots of things that are non-renewable that are very sustainable. Iron ore, for example. There is enough iron ore in the Earth's crust to last forever. I mean, I don't mean forever, of course, because that's infinite, but what I do mean is that we're never going to run out of iron ore on this world. It's just so abundant. But it's non-renewable. Then we come to green. The most problematic of all those terms because it has no definition. At its worst, it's basically just a crass marketing term to sell things to us. Everything is green now. When we started Greenpeace, and even when I started Green Spirit nearly 20 years ago, the word green was not yet used to describe products in the marketplace like it is today. People who have even nothing to do with energy are putting windmills in their ads. Car companies are putting windmills in their ads to make themselves look green. This term is almost completely useless, as it has been totally overused to describe cars, green cars, made of steel and using fossil fuels. So I think that the important terms there are renewable, clean, and sustainable, but the two most important terms are sustainable and clean. Just because something is non-renewable doesn't mean it can't be sustainable and clean. And therefore, instead of having renewable portfolio standards as our mandates for moving energy forward, we should have clean, sustainable portfolio standards, which would include hydroelectric power. Did you know that most states in their renewable portfolio standard, which is basically a term which means renewable energy mandate, requirement for utilities to make a certain amount of their energy from renewable sources, that in most states hydroelectric energy is not counted as a renewable technology. It's completely ridiculous. It's arbitrary and capricious. But that is the nature of the politics around renewable energy. Basically, only wind and solar are seen as politically acceptable or politically correct, when in fact there are other renewable energy sources that should be emphasized instead of wind and solar. I mentioned hydroelectric. Then there is biomass energy. Most people don't realize it, but wood and other woody materials constitute 75% of the world's renewable energy. Wood is the most important renewable energy resource on this planet, followed by hydroelectric. But most wood isn't used to make electricity. It's used for cooking and heating, primarily, 2 billion people depend on wood as their primary source of energy. We should be growing more trees and using more wood, not only for energy and for biofuels in the future made from cellulose, but for building. Now, my old friends in Greenpeace, they don't take that view. They're basically against cutting trees. Now, how can an environmental group be against the most important renewable energy and material resource on the planet for supporting human civilization, and also be against the second most important renewable energy resource in the world, which is hydroelectric power? What kind of environmentalism is that rules out the first and second most important, which if added together are so much larger than all of the other renewable technologies put together and always will be? It doesn't make sense to me. The third most important renewable energy resource is geothermal heat pump technology, otherwise known as ground source heat pumps. Not far from here in Oklahoma City, Climate Master is one of the largest producers of this technology. There are 1 million homes in the United States that use geothermal heat pumps instead of using gas furnaces and gas hot water heaters. It takes fossil fuels out of buildings altogether and also produces your air conditioning. It's more important than wind and solar put together by far for the future of our technology and our civilization, and yet hardly anybody talks about it. Unfortunately, it's a box in your basement with pipes in the ground, whereas everybody likes the high-techy looking solar panels and windmills out in the open for everyone to see, making a statement about how green we are. But it's an illusion, and it's also a bubble. The solar and wind bubble will come and go because people will soon realize that it's not a good idea to waste that much money no matter how rich we are. You don't see them putting in a lot of wind and solar installations in Africa because they could not afford such a thing. That's not a solution for them. The solution for them is to put hydroelectric dams on the Congo River and build nuclear plants. Then they will have a basis to build an industrial civilization like we have done here. The global nuclear picture is very interesting. The United States is just actually beginning to catch up in some ways, especially with the countries in Asia. Today, China is building 21 nuclear plants under construction, and they have plans for 50 to 100 more. It is a fact that the US has more nuclear plants than any other country at 104. But China, Russia, India, South Korea, Taiwan, and other Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam has announced it will build its first nuclear plant. Indonesia is very interested, and so is Malaysia. But countries that already have nuclear, like India, China, and Russia, are planning 50 or 100 new plants, and it's already on the drawing boards. These plans are moving forward. Russia is more advanced in many aspects of nuclear technology than the United States. Fast breeder reactors, for example, being one, and small reactors used for remote towns. They are ahead. Many countries are ahead of the United States in recycling used nuclear fuel, which isn't even being done here at all, so it's pretty hard to get ahead. It's pretty hard to improve the technology of recycling used nuclear fuel if you aren't even doing it, but we'll get to that in just a sec. Europe is very interesting too. Sweden, which had passed in the 70s a moratorium against any new nuclear reactors, has completely reversed that position in the last year and has now taken the position that they will replace all their nuclear reactors when they come to their end of life with larger ones than the ones that are there now. Back in the day, reactors were more like 500 megawatts. Now they're 1,200, 1,500, even 1,600 megawatts. So they're planning to replace their reactors with, so they will increase their amount of nuclear energy rather than shutting it down like they had planned. Germany, just the other day, now that they have a right-center coalition as opposed to the previous left-center coalition, which included the Greens in order to have a majority, they had a policy on the books, a law on the books, that all their nuclear reactors had to shut down in 2021. That has just been reversed by the Merkel government, and they have agreed to extend the life of all those reactors considerably into the future so that they can get their act together and figure out what they're actually going to do when those reactors do come to their end of life. They were intending to shut them down prematurely. They have now decided they will not do that. Italy has just made the decision to build 4 nuclear reactors. They had a moratorium against nuclear energy. That has been lifted, and they are planning to build 4 and then another 4. An Italian company, Enel, is actually building nuclear reactors in Slovakia right now. All of the Eastern Bloc countries that had Soviet-style reactors that have joined the EU recently have had to agree to shut those reactors down prematurely, especially the Chernobyl-style design, many of which have continued to operate in the years since the Chernobyl accident with better safety systems and safety procedures. But they've had to agree to replace all of those with better reactors, either better reactors that Russia is now building, they have learned their lesson from Chernobyl, or reactors from the West. So countries, and Finland is now, what country has more of an environmental ethic than Finland, is now building the world's largest nuclear reactor, the Areva design 1600 megawatt reactor, and that will come online in 2012, I believe. So Europe is fast moving away from the recent opposition to nuclear to embracing it wholeheartedly once again. This has to happen here too. The United States has 70% fossil fuel electricity, 20% nuclear electricity, 6% hydroelectric, we're up to 96%. All the rest put together, the wind and solar and everything else, is 4%. We cannot take a big inroad into fossil fuels with wind and solar. As a matter of fact, it's self-defeating because it's so expensive and doesn't do much in the end. Because, as I say, every time you build a wind farm, you have to build something to back it up. In most cases, that's going to be a gas plant. Nuclear can't back up wind because you can't turn it on and off quickly. Hydroelectric can back up wind, but that's only available in a few regions in the United States. Coal can't back up wind because coal can't be turned on and off quickly either. So really, in most parts of the US, you're left with an increasing reliance on gas every time you put in a wind farm or a solar farm. And you pay between 3 and 10 times as much for the electricity that is produced from that wind farm or solar farm. Nuclear energy is safe. No member of the public has ever been harmed in the United States in 50 years of nuclear plant operation. Within the last 6 months, 75 people died in a Russian hydroelectric accident. 6 people died in a Connecticut gas plant explosion. 29 people died in the coal mine. 11 people died on the BP oil rig. All of these people were getting energy for us. Nobody has died in a nuclear plant in the United States history. 3 Mile Island didn't even hurt anybody, even though it was a bad mechanical failure and cost billions of dollars. No one was harmed because the plant was designed in such a way as to keep the nuclear materials inside when they had that loss of coolant and meltdown accident. Nuclear plants are safe. It is safer to work in a nuclear plant in the United States than it is to work in either real estate or financial services. That is US Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is safe to work in a nuclear plant from other statistics too, like the Columbia University 2004 study of 53,000 nuclear plant workers across the country. It proved conclusively, statistically, that they have fewer cancers, less disease, and live longer than the average American citizen. In other words, it's safer to work in a nuclear plant full-time than it is to be a normal person. Well, I shouldn't have put it that way. A regular person. No, that's not right either. a non-nuclear plant worker like us, or some of us. I mentioned the cost. I also mentioned the CO2. When it comes to being clean, if you're concerned about the climate issue and you want to reduce CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, nuclear energy is the most powerful technology we have to achieve that. You can replace 1,000 megawatts of coal-fired power plant with one nuclear reactor and reduce all of that millions of tons of annual CO2 emissions. So I urge you to consider joining the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition. It is free. You will not be bombarded with emails. You might get 1 or 2 a year updating you on the progress of the organization, but we need people to register their support for this important direction in energy policy in the United States. President Obama is a strong supporter of nuclear energy, as are a majority of people in the Democratic Party and a majority of congressional representatives on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, it's virtually unanimous in favor of nuclear energy. There is a very small and vociferous opposition that continues, but it is nothing like it was in the 70s and 80s. There are not tens of thousands of people marching in the street against nuclear energy. It's time we recognize that a vast majority of people in this country support new nuclear power and get on with the job. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you for that presentation. We'll have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Right there. Okay.
I don't know what I missed.
Hi, I'm a Clinton School student and wanted to thank you, Dr. Moore, for being here to speak to us today. There are clear benefits to nuclear energy, but when you consider revamping the energy infrastructure for a country, you have to consider the negative impacts too. So could you speak to that, especially what to do with the radioactive materials that come out of it and all of that? Thank you.
Yes, and I didn't talk about nuclear waste, as it's called, because I was hoping for a question. First off, on changing the infrastructure, I'm not advocating that we tear down everything that's out there now that is working perfectly well and replace it in a crash program. I am saying that we change direction. As I mentioned, when a coal plant comes to end of life, consider seriously whether that might best be replaced with a nuclear plant rather than a new coal plant. That kind of thing. We will always be using quite a bit of gas for electricity as long as that resource is available, because it's so versatile for peaking power. You can turn it on in a flash and turn it off just as quickly. It's like hydroelectric. It's very versatile in that way. So it will be used into the future as long as gas prices remain at a somewhat reasonable level. And with all these new gas discoveries in the US and now in other parts of the world, the so-called shale gas, it's liable to be around for a long time. The main thing to consider is the coal-nuclear percentages. It's 20% nuclear, 50% coal. Perhaps in 4 or 5 decades from now, we could be working towards reversing that ratio in an orderly fashion. Nuclear waste. A lot of the critics of nuclear energy say there is no solution to the problem of nuclear waste. And therefore, that's a deal breaker, and we shouldn't build any nuclear plants because there's no solution to this problem. I would ask you to consider the fact that there actually isn't any problem. The used nuclear fuel, as we prefer to call it, is being stored safely and securely at existing nuclear sites, not harming anyone, and not threatening to harm anyone at any time in the foreseeable future. Now, how is that a problem? If it was harming people, I would say, we got a problem. Let's try and solve it. But it isn't harming anyone. For example, the emissions from coal-fired power plants, we know the medical evidence is there and clear that they are harming people by those wastes coming out. But no waste is coming out of nuclear plants that is harming anyone. More important, though, is the fact that 95% of the available energy is still in those used fuel rods. They are one of the most important future energy resources for the United States. And they are a domestic resource. Even if the uranium was bought from some other country in the first place, now they're here. And those fuel rods, if they were in a reactor, say we've been 50 years now of running nuclear in the US, all of that used nuclear fuel can be recycled into 1,000 years worth of fuel or more. That's how important it is. The problem is, used nuclear fuel recycling is more expensive than new uranium. And because the nuclear industry in the United States is private and based on making efficient decisions to maximize efficiency and make some money, why would you buy a recycling plant for used nuclear fuel when you can buy new uranium cheaper? In other countries, though, like France is the best example, the whole electricity infrastructure is owned by the government. All of the nuclear plants, all 59 of the nuclear plants in France, are state-owned. So when they think about the issue of recycling, they're not thinking in terms of the profit motive entirely. Of course, they want to deliver reasonable cost energy to the country, and they do. Energy prices are quite reasonable in France because it's 80% nuclear. But they're looking at the future of the situation and saying, we're going to have to recycle those used fuel rods one of these days. Why don't we start now and at least recycle part of our used nuclear fuel so we can be doing it? How can you improve the technology of recycling used nuclear fuel if you are not even doing it, as is the situation in the United States? But the fact of the matter is, France has solved this problem. As a matter of fact, it's not a problem, it is a solution. The solution of getting the 95% of the energy that's still in those fuel rods and using it to make electricity. The fairly small amount of actual waste in the used nuclear fuel is called the fission products. They are the result of the uranium splitting when it was in the reactor and forming radioactive byproducts called fission products. What they do in France and in a number of other countries is you melt glass. Basically, glass is made from sand, so basically you're melting silica, sand. And then you pour the fission products into the molten glass and cool it so it basically becomes a rock, a solid lump of glass, in which are the fission products. Then you encase that in stainless steel and put it into purpose-built silos inside a building. The silos are in the ground, down 80 feet, and monitor it for 300 years, at which time it has basically decayed into non-radioactive substances. That is the solution. And it is easy to do from an engineering point of view. We are quite capable of all of these things. And say, for example, the casks that are now holding the used nuclear fuel at the reactor sites, say they decayed and there became a concern that they might decay sufficiently that they would expose the radiation inside. You take the fuel rods out and put it into a new container. It's simple. We know how to make containers. The containers that they're putting the used fuel in today are licensed for 120 years by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, outdoors in the weather. If you put a roof over them and control the climate, temperature and humidity, they'd be good for 2,000 years, those containers. The nuclear waste, as it's called, is not liquid, it is solid. Little pellets, little black pellets that are slightly warm because they are radioactive. They are not corrosive in the slightest. They can't get out. They're not fidgeting around in there. They're not corroding anything. They're just sitting in there. It's like putting bricks in a concrete container, reinforced steel concrete container. Is there a possibility that the bricks could get out by themselves? No. And that is the situation we have. The used fuel is safe and secure and not harming anyone, and one day we're going to reuse it and recycle it. And whether that's 10 years from now or 100 years from now doesn't really matter.
How much does a typical nuclear power plant use? What would be a typical power plant? How much used fuel would it have that you're storing space-wise?
All of the used fuel that has been produced by all of the nuclear reactors in the United States would cover a football field approximately 20 feet deep. So you can see that's a very small amount of material.
Mr. Moore. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Moore, a couple of questions. One would be, in a strategic planning model where you're looking at a trajectory of cost of energy, you mentioned that solar energy was about 10 times the cost of conventional energy now. Does that projection hold true in the future? That's number one. Number two, could you address I still think there's a real and perceived risk of atomic energy, let's say because of a terrorist attack on a nuclear plant. Could you address those two issues?
Sorry, the first one again.
It was about the cost, the trajectory of
the cost of solar
energy versus
well, for some reason, for example, in Europe, where it's easier to see the costs, here they are hidden. The way it's done, because ratepayers in the United States and citizens in general are much more prone to rebel against people in putting higher costs on them. Whereas in Europe, they're more used to the state deciding everything for them. And so here, what you have is a situation where politicians pass legislation which forces the utilities to purchase a certain percentage of their power from wind and solar, basically. There's no price mentioned in there anywhere, and the utility ends up negotiating with different people who say they want to put in wind and solar, and a price gets set, but it gets all mixed into the rate base, and it's seen as though solar is less than 1%. People don't notice it, right? But over in Europe, what they have is a system called feed-in tariffs, where the law that's passed says that the utilities must purchase solar power at such and such a cost for a 20-year period guaranteed. And so in Europe, solar is pegged at around 60 to 70 US cents a kilowatt hour, which is at least 10 times as much as electricity costs here. That means that the utility, if someone puts in a solar installation, gets a license to put in a solar installation, the utility is then required to buy that for a fixed price over a 20-year period based on a 10 to 15% return on investment. So these kinds of feed-in tariffs have been adopted in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, and possibly some other countries that I'm not aware of. And it's basically breaking the bank for them. But there's no indication that the cost is going to come down. You know, most of these solar panels, for example, are being made in China. About 95% of the solar panels are being made in China. There's no lower cost place to make those solar panels. That's why they're being made there. So I don't see how you can do it cheaper. Now, if someone comes up with something cheaper, great. But what we're doing now is we are deploying in a large scale a technology which is not cheaper. What we should be doing is taking 10% of that money or so and putting it into focused R&D and making sure we have a cost-effective technology before we start deploying it all over the place and forcing people to pay for it, which they otherwise would not do if they were given a free choice. These are both legislated requirements that interfere with the market in such an extreme degree. You know, there's nobody would put in solar panels if they had to pay the price. But the fact is they do pay. I saw an interesting story in the Herald Tribune the other day. It said small towns in Italy are making a profit from renewable energy. And what it meant is that the small town is investing in solar panels and thereby getting the feed-in tariff rate and making money. But it's really just a transfer. The people of Italy are paying for these little towns to make this money off this exorbitantly expensive electricity. And we got to see things that way, because we can't, you know, even the richest country can't afford to squander precious capital on technologies that cost so much more than you can do it in a even better way. And not only does nuclear cost a lot less than these technologies, but it is reliable. You can count on it. We cannot have a system of energy technology where you say, okay, the factory has to stay shut today because there's no wind or there's no sun. You know, so I just don't get why they are getting so much favoritism in the system. If we're going to incentivize something, it should be something that works, that doesn't cost 10 times as much. And therefore, I would say focus on hydroelectric, biomass, geothermal, heat pump technology, and nuclear, all of which are clean and sustainable, and three of which are renewable as well. The threat of terrorism. Well, first off, no terrorist has ever tried to attack a nuclear plant. That would be somewhat of a clue as to what targets they thought were useful and which ones weren't. They tend to attack subways and iconic buildings and governments and stuff like that. So no one is attacking nuclear plants. In addition, even though terrorism wasn't around of the type that we had at 9/11 back when all these nuclear plants were built, the people who licensed them considered the possibility that an airplane might fall out of the sky onto one, because they're all mostly near big cities and therefore near big airports. And so they did take that into account. If you look at the cross-section of the containment structure on a nuclear plant, it's about 5 feet, like this thick. And I was told, yeah, it's reinforced concrete. So I'm thinking rebar, like you normally see in a building, which, you know, is maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The rebar in those things is 4 inches in diameter. And it just doesn't go up and down. It also goes sideways and both ways diagonally. So you have got a cage there of steel, then with concrete all around it, and a 1-inch thick steel liner on the inside of all that. Airplanes can't go through that. We have, unfortunately, a misconception about the amount of damage an aircraft can cause to a large structure, because the trade towers were a very flimsy design. They were elegant as could be in their design, very lightweight. They had no large reinforced concrete pillars inside them. They're this suspended floor thing. And so it was like an airplane running into another airplane, basically, when those 757s hit those buildings. They just went right through them. But if they had rammed into the Empire State Building, it would still be standing very proud with a big black mark in the side of it. But it wouldn't go through the building, and it certainly wouldn't knock it over. So I do not believe that the threat of terrorism at nuclear plants is a serious one, both because terrorists don't seem to think those are good things to attack, and because they're pretty much impenetrable. And it would be a real bad day at the plant. There's no doubt about that. And people would be killed, especially the people in the plane. But it would not penetrate the nuclear core.
We have time for one more. Right there.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Moore. I come from a country, I'm Japanese, by the way, and I come from a country where we have over 50 nuclear reactors for a country smaller than the size of California. So we obviously invest heavily in nuclear as well as in other energy sources such as solar. And despite the fact that we lost 2 power plant operators in 1999 due to a nuclear power plant accident, we still continue to invest heavily in nuclear energy. And I found it very interesting that you just kept talking about the cost of energy. I've seen the cost it takes for the nuclear power plants in Pope County near Russellville, how much it takes for those power plants to create energy. And you're right, it's very cheap. Once nuclear power plants are paid off, they're like cash cows. They produce energy very cheap. but they do cost a lot of money to build. So I would like for you to elaborate on how much it costs to build nuclear power plants, and how do you think that we should finance construction of nuclear power plants, especially given your criticism against government subsidies?
A nuclear power plant today of the sort of medium-sized 1,000 megawatt plant is in the neighborhood of $6 billion, or perhaps a little more, but in that sort of neighborhood. The difference between capital cost and operating cost is very important. The compact fluorescent light bulb is a good example. They have a high capital cost, but a very much lower operating cost than an incandescent bulb. If you build a house with a geothermal heat pump system and really well insulated, so it's highly energy efficient, it's going to cost you a lot more than if you just build a crummy house with a gas furnace and have to burn a lot of gas because you haven't got decent insulation and you haven't got double glazed windows and all that. The house will cost a lot less to build, but a tremendous lot more to operate. It's actually one of the main dysfunctions in our society, especially in buildings, because the people who build our buildings are very seldom the same people that are going to have to pay to operate them for 60 years. And so that creates a dysfunction. Because if the person who was building the building knew that they were going to have to pay to operate it, that's why government buildings tend to be leaders in energy efficiency and in mandating heat pump technology, for example. Because they know that they, the building authority, whatever it is going to end up having to pay to operate that building for 60 years into the future. Again, when it comes to solar, we're just not even thinking straight. We are just making this decision as if it's some kind of right thing to do that you believe in, not even taking into account the economics at all. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. So it's a very irrational thing that we are doing with solar. With nuclear power, as you say, yes, it costs a lot of money to build one. But then you have clean, reliable, safe, cost-effective power for decades into the future. The new generation of nuclear plants will probably be 80-year lifespan plants. So even if it takes 30 or 40 years to pay the plant down, the capital cost, then you got 40 years of gravy, as you say, cash cow. But what that means is that it's at a reasonable price for the ratepayer. And we have to remember that energy underlies almost everything we do. The magnification of the speaker of my voice, the lights that make it possible to see each other in here, the fan that's going over there, the heating and cooling equipment for the building, and all of the transportation that people took to get here, and all of the same technologies in the homes that you came from. Energy underlies all the services and goods that we have in our whole society. Every time you increase the cost of energy by 1%, you increase the cost of everything that we do. And so it's extremely important to pay attention to the cost of energy. It's possibly the most important thing to pay attention to. And yet we are allowing our energy policy to be skewed by this fantasy that we can run civilization on energy technologies that cost 10 times as much or 3 times as much and are only available a small percentage of the time. It's simply not possible. It's both economically unsustainable and technically unsustainable because of the intermittency and the unreliability. You can't run schools and hospitals and factories on energy that just disappears for 4 days at a time. We have to have electricity 24/7 in order to have the society that we have. And in some ways, the difference between a civilized and an uncivilized society is 24/7 power. If you look around the world at the 1.2 billion people who do not have on-demand electricity, you will see the poorest people, the shortest lived people, the least educated people, the worst health care in the world is in those places, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are about half a billion people without power. I think no, there's I think it's half a billion there. My numbers are escaping me a little bit, but it's like a billion plus people worldwide. And about half of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the rest of them are in India. Interestingly, even though China does not have the same per capita income as we do in the Western countries that all enjoy 24-hour power, including Japan, they only have a very small percentage of people without 24-hour electricity, which goes to show you that organization and dedication to programs can make up for lack of being really wealthy. So it goes to show you in Africa, for example, where you have so much corruption and tribalism and all of that, you've got an unfocused and unorganized situation, and there's all these people end up with no electricity. In India, it's improving faster, but they still have a huge number of people without power, and they are the poorest of the people, partly because they have no power. Because when you have power, you can do miracles compared to when you don't.